In our previous video, we learned or began to learn a method to symbolize in a step-by-step and very perfectly reliable way using finding the main operator at each step. And we started to learn how the key for applying that, or the most important piece of applying that, the trickiest part, is figuring out what's the main operator at each step. So what we have is a test to help us figure out what's the main operator. It's this removal test that I've been talking about. Delete the logical vocabulary and see what you're left with. There's a little wrinkle to it, and so that's what I'm going to work through in this video. I'm going to show you how the removal test works in a little bit more detail, how it handles some problems. We need to talk about actually how commas work, and how that whole method works. And I'm going to be doing two examples in this video, which are homework problems. So good video to watch. Let's get going. We can use this conditional test to say, or this removal test to say, when is a conditional the main operator? Okay. When we take, what happens if we delete the conditional vocabulary, the if or the only if or the if and the then and so on? What are we left with? What remains? Well, if they're more than two sentences or less than two sentences, if there's ungrammatical stuff, then what we deleted was not the main operator. But if when we delete that thing and we're left with exactly two sentences, then basically we can say that's the main operator. There's a little bit of a caveat to that, though, and that's what we need to talk about right now, and we're going to look at another example. Here is our problem. This is 1.6 LRS 63. It's another homework problem, so it'd be a good idea to follow along. If there's traffic, he'll be on time if he leaves early. First step is to find the logic vocabulary, the words that will turn into logical symbols, not sentence letters, but the logical symbols. So we got, and right now it's just the arrow. So there's this if, and there's this if. So we have two ifs, and those are two possible, those are both going to become, or those are conditionals, and we're going to end up putting in arrows in our symbolization for corresponding to each of these ifs. We have to decide which one to symbolize first. The one we symbolize first is the main operator, so we want to figure out which one is the main operator. We've been talking about this removal test, and so let's try applying it. If we remove this if, the question is, are we left with exactly two sentences? And we are. We have he leaves early, that's a sentence, and if there's traffic, he'll be on time. So this if, the second if, passes the removal test. Let's take a look at the first if. Let's see if it passes the removal test. Well, at first we might not be sure there's traffic, he'll be on time if he leaves early, but we say, wait a minute, there are actually two sentences here if we notice the comma. There's one sentence on the one side of the comma, and there's traffic, and another sentence on the other side of the comma. He'll be on time if he leaves early. So if we let this whole thing break at the comma, then actually this if also passes the removal test. So this one does because we're left with sentence 1, sentence 2, and this if does because we're left with sentence 1, sentence 2. So which one is the main operator? It's the one that's associated with the comma. Both of these pass the removal test. When we're left with multiple pieces of logical vocabulary that pass the removal test, then the main operator is the one that makes the sentence break at the comma. And this one makes the sentence break at the comma. So this is the main operator. So this is the conditional. The antecedent is what comes after the if up until the comma. And the consequent is what comes after the comma. Okay, now there's traffic. That's just Q, step by step. And this if we did not bring down, we just brought down there's if traffic. The if has turned into that arrow. Okay, now he'll be on time if he leaves early. Well, that's an if sentence, so it's a conditional. We have to decide what the antecedent is and what the consequent is. Our logical vocabulary is if. What comes after the if is the antecedent. Left to right order doesn't matter. It's what comes to the right of the if, and what comes to the right of the if is he leaves early. So he leaves early, that's the antecedent, which is R, and he'll be on time. What remains is the consequent, which is Q. No, it's P. There's traffic Q, he leaves early R, he'll be on time P. There is our symbolization. So what we've seen is that the removal test is nice, but by itself it's not always sufficient to figure out which of our pieces of vocabulary are the main operator. We sometimes have to say, okay, both of these pieces of vocabulary pass the test. The main operator then is the one that splits the sentence at the comma. This is the one that splits the sentence at the comma, and so this is the main operator. So we just bring it down its pieces, and then that's easy. This is easy as long as we remember how if works, that whatever comes after if is actually the antecedent. And then we're good to go. So that's the removal test. So let's just review that. So we have this full removal test for finding the main operator. The question we ask is, when we delete a conditional, do exactly two sentences remain? If when we delete that conditional, the if, only if, then, whatever, if we're not left with exactly two sentences, if we're left with more or less or gobbledygook, then that conditional is not the main operator. If, on the other hand, that conditional, if we're left with two sentences, and that's the only piece of logical vocabulary that's like that, then that is the main connective. On the other hand, if multiple conditionals pass the test, multiple ifs and only ifs and so on, like we just saw, then which one of them is the main? Then one of them is the main connective, and anything that, or the main operator, anything that doesn't pass the test is not the main operator. Of the remaining ones, which is the main operator? It's the one that makes the sentence break at the comma. So now we have, and there aren't other good general methods, okay? So what we have for symbolizing. So here is our method to symbolize using trees in the symbolization module. We're basically parsing. So we find all the conditional words, and we figure out which one of them is the main operator. How do we do that? We use the removal text in commas. We symbolize the main operator, and the immediate pieces go in the lower text boxes. And then we just repeat this method on the pieces until every text box is broken down to an atomic sentence, and then each of those atomic sentences turns into a sentence letter. So let's look at one more example of doing all this with an even more complex sentence. Here we have 1.6 LRS 62, another homework problem. If she leaves early if there's traffic, she'll have breakfast only if she eats cereal. She's only going to have time to eat breakfast if she's leaving. The only way she can eat breakfast is if, and she doesn't have time, is if she eats cereal. Okay, so let's give this one a shot. We want to find all the logical vocabulary. Well, this time there are three. There's this if, there's this if, and then there's this only if. So we have three candidates. Oh boy. So let's see. Let's look at this if. What happens if we delete it? Well, if there are exactly two sentences, it passes the test. If not, it doesn't pass the test, and it's not the main operator. This if does not pass the test. If she leaves early, not a sentence. She leaves early, no problem, that's a sentence. But if she leaves early is not a sentence, and this is also not a sentence. It's too much. So it's not all sort of put together. So this if is not the main connective. It does not pass the test. How about this one? The only if. Let's take it out. She eats cereal? That's okay. If she leaves early if there's traffic, she'll have breakfast. That's okay too. So when we delete this only if, we're left with two sentences. Sentence 1, sentence 2. So the only if passes the removal test, and it's a candidate for the main operator. Let's look at our last piece of logical vocabulary, this if, and let's delete it and see what we're left with. Well, indeed, we're left with two sentences. She'll have breakfast only if she eats cereal, and she leaves early if there's traffic, with the comma separating them. So we have candidate 1, which passes the removal test, the only if, and candidate 2, which passes the removal test, the initial if. The initial if is the one that breaks the sentence at the comma, and that means that this is the main operator. So we know our whole sentence is a conditional. This is the main operator, and what is to the right of it up to the comma is the antecedent. That means that's the antecedent, and that's the consequent, because it's what's left. It's what's after the comma. She leaves, so okay, easy. And we remember this if, we don't bring down in the boxes, it's turned into that arrow symbol. She leaves early if there's traffic. This is a conditional. It's an if. The antecedent is whatever is to the right of the if, so there's traffic, leaving she leaves early to be the consequent. There's traffic is a Q. She leaves early is P. Good, we're done with this side. She'll have breakfast only if she eats cereal. Okay, well, so again, it's a conditional from the only if. Only if, well, whatever comes after the only if is the consequent. So she eats cereal, and that is S. The antecedent is whatever comes before the only if. So she'll have breakfast, or to the left of the only if, I should say. Well, what's the other part of the only if? And that's she'll have breakfast, and that's R. And so there is our symbolization. So we have what looks like a big tricky sentence. We've got one if, another only if. We might guess right that this is it, but that would have been just a guess. And so we can systematically figure out, okay, is it this? Is it this? Is it this that we symbolize first? That's the main operator. We use our removal test, which rules out that one. And then when it's between these two, we say, okay, well, which one makes a sentence break at the comma? It's this one. So that's the main operator. It turns into the arrow. Everything else comes down into there. This if turns into that arrow. We move that into the antecedent, that into the consequent. And same thing over here. This only if turns into that arrow. She eats cereal, is in the consequent. She'll have breakfast is in the antecedent. There's our sentence. So while this might have looked initially intimidating, it's actually very straightforward as long as we just move through that test step by step. And that test will always, literally always work for you if you just go step by step. And of course, if you have any questions about it, it takes a little while to learn and get comfortable with it, then let me know, ask questions on the discussion board and so on. That's exactly what that's for. So what you need to do now in terms of your symbolizing is just get comfortable with that method and you'll be good to go. If you don't, then it's going to be a little dicey. You're going to be guessing. You might guess right, you might guess wrong. Use this method. Once you learn how to use it, and you can learn how to use it, you'll be very reliable at symbolizing. So I strongly encourage you to use this main operator removal test method. Let me know if you have any questions, and good luck with your symbolizing homework.